They should have come back as heroes. In June 1971, 3 Soviet cosmonauts became the first humans in history to live inside a space station. They reached Salyut 1, stayed there for more than 3 weeks, and proved that life in orbit was no longer just a dream. From the ground, it looked like a victory so big it would help define the future of spaceflight. But inside that station, the mission was already becoming something far darker than the public understood. The air turned bad. Smoke filled the cabin. Fire forced emergency action. And when it was finally time to leave, the descent back to Earth appeared normal. The capsule separated. Re-entry began. The parachutes deployed. Everything looked under control. But Soyuz 11 was no longer a triumph. It was already a disaster. This is the real story of the first crew to live in a space station, and how one of the greatest milestones in space history turned into one of its coldest warnings. At the start, Soyuz 11 did not look like a tragedy at all. It looked like the future arriving ahead of schedule. The Soviet Union had already launched Salyut 1, the first space station in human history, and that changed the meaning of spaceflight overnight. Up to that point, most missions were still built around a simple idea: go up, survive, come back. Salyut suggested something bigger. It suggested that orbit might stop being a place people merely visited and start becoming a place they could inhabit. That is why Soyuz 11 mattered so much. This was no stunt, no brief symbolic orbit, no quick dash to plant a flag and return. The goal was to show that human beings could actually live off Earth for an extended period and function inside a man-made outpost circling the planet. The mission carried Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, and from the moment they launched, everything about the flight carried the weight of national prestige and historical firsts. There was already pressure because Soyuz 10, the earlier attempt to visit Salyut 1, had managed to dock but failed to enter the station. Soyuz 11 had to finish the job. When the crew finally docked and crossed into Salyut 1, they became the first human beings ever to inhabit a space station. It was the kind of moment that should have felt clean and triumphant. Instead, one of the first things they encountered was a bad atmosphere inside. The air was smoky and foul enough that they had to deal with ventilation issues and wait before settling in properly. Even at the threshold of history, the station was already reminding them that space habitats are not homes. They are machines. They only pretend to be homes when every system works. And that is where Soyuz 11 becomes perfect for this channel, because the mission did not turn frightening all at once. It turned frightening the way real missions often do, through discomfort first. Through little signs that the environment is less stable than it appears from far away. Salyut 1 was revolutionary, but it was also cramped, metallic, improvised, and unforgiving. The men were not floating through some wide cinematic palace in orbit. They were living inside a narrow laboratory where every wall was equipment, every movement had to be managed, and every hour depended on pressure, airflow, power, seals, switches, and routines holding together. From Earth, the story was progress. Inside, the experience was closer to endurance. They worked through experiments, maintenance, television broadcasts, exercise routines, and the strange physical demands of living in zero gravity for days turning into weeks. They were proving something enormous, but they were doing it inside a fragile shell where one serious failure could turn history into an obituary. Then one of those warnings arrived in a form no crew ever forgets: fire. During the mission, an electrical problem led to smoke and a fire event serious enough that abandoning the station became a real possibility. Think about what that means in orbit. Not in a building where you can run outside. Not in an aircraft that might still land quickly. In a space station. Sealed. Remote. Fragile. The first permanent foothold humanity had built above Earth suddenly felt less like a symbol of mastery and more like a trap waiting for the wrong sequence of failures. And yet they stayed. They continued. They endured the station long enough to complete a record-setting mission of more than 3 weeks, proving the basic idea that long-duration life in orbit was possible, even if the reality was harsher than the triumphal images suggested. If you like real space stories where the truth is more intense than fiction, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like on this video, because from this point on Soyuz 11 stops being a difficult mission and becomes something far more haunting. By the time they prepared to leave Salyut 1, the crew had already secured their place in history. They had done what no one had ever done before. They had lived in a station, worked there, and stayed long enough to prove that orbit could be more than a brief destination. In the public imagination, this should have been the moment where the mission turned back into a victory. Pack the materials. Seal the hatches. Undock. Come home. Let the photographers capture the exhausted smiles. Let the newspapers declare a new era. And from the outside, that is almost exactly how it looked. They loaded samples, film, and equipment into the Soyuz spacecraft, undocked from Salyut 1, and began the return sequence. There was no obvious sign to the people waiting below that they were watching the final phase of a fatal mission. Then, during the preparations for re-entry, a pressure equalization valve in the descent module opened too early during module separation. It sounds small. It sounds technical. It sounds like the kind of detail that should not be able to kill 3 men who had already survived everything else. But in space, pressure is life. Air is life. Time is life. Once that valve opened, the cabin began to depressurize. There was no huge explosion for the world to see. No cinematic disaster unfolding against the blackness of space. The atmosphere inside the capsule simply began escaping into the void. The crew had almost no time. Investigations later concluded that the cabin pressure fell with terrifying speed, and that the men likely lost the ability to function within seconds. One of them may have tried to reach the valve. It did not matter. The spacecraft itself kept doing what it was supposed to do. That is the part that makes Soyuz 11 so cold. The capsule continued descending. The parachutes deployed. The landing systems worked. To everyone on the ground, it looked routine. It looked controlled. It looked successful. That final contrast is what turned Soyuz 11 from a tragedy into a permanent warning. Recovery teams approached the landed capsule expecting the usual scene after a difficult but historic flight. Exhausted men, weak perhaps, dehydrated perhaps, but alive. Instead, when the hatch was opened, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev were found motionless inside. The mission had returned to Earth. The crew had not. Few stories in spaceflight are as disturbing as that simple fact. They were not lost in deep space. They were not vaporized in front of the world. They were not drifting somewhere beyond rescue for days. They were right there. Home was beneath them. The planet had them back. The capsule was intact enough to open with human hands. And still, the first crew ever to inhabit a space station had died in silence just before the finish. Soyuz 11 remains uniquely haunting because it strips away the fantasy that the greatest dangers of exploration always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes death comes quietly. Through one valve. One seal. One hidden vulnerability in a machine people trusted enough to climb inside. The mission also left a permanent mark on spacecraft design. After the disaster, Soyuz vehicles were redesigned so cosmonauts could wear pressure suits during launch and landing, and the spacecraft configuration changed accordingly. In other words, this mission did not just end 3 lives. It changed how future crews would survive. But even that does not soften the image at the center of the story: 3 men making history in orbit, enduring smoke, confinement, stress, and danger, surviving the return through the atmosphere, touching down on Earth, and still being gone before anyone could reach them. That is why Soyuz 11 deserves to be remembered not only as a Soviet disaster, but as one of the purest examples of what space really is. Not empty adventure. Not clean heroism. A hostile environment that allows no mistake, forgives nothing, and sometimes waits until the mission looks won before it takes everything.